Chapter 13 of Beyond the Rocks, a Love Story by Elinor Glyn. "What have I done? What have I done?" Hector groaned to himself in anguish as he paced up and down his room at the Ritz an hour after the party had broken up, and he had driven Mrs. McBride back in his automobile, leaving hers to father and daughter. All through supper Theodora had sat limp and white as death, and every time she had looked at him her eyes had reminded him of a fawn he had wounded once at Brackendale in the park with his bow and arrow when he was a little boy. He remembered how fearfully proud he had been as he saw it fall, and then how it had lain in his arms and bled, and its tender eyes had gazed at him in no reproach, only sorrow and pain, and a dumb asking why he had hurt it. All the light of the stars seemed quenched. No eyes in the world had ever looked so unutterably pathetic as Theodora's eyes, and gradually, as they sat and talked platitudes and chaffed with the elderly fiancés, it had come to him how cruel he had been. He who had deliberately used every art to make her love him, and now, having gained his end, what could he do for her? What for himself? Nothing but sorrow faced them both. He had taken brutal advantage of her gentleness and innocence, when chivalry alone should have made him refrain. He saw himself as he was, the hunter and she the hunted, and the knowledge that he would pay with all the anguish and regret of a passionate, hopeless love, perhaps for the rest of his life, did not balance things to his awakened soul. If his years should be one long gnawing ache for her, what of hers? And she was so young. His life, at all events, was a free one, but hers tied to Josiah Brown. And this thought drove him to madness. She belonged to Josiah Brown, not to him whom she loved, but to Josiah Brown, plebeian and middle-aged and exacting. He knew now that he ought to have gone away at once, the next day after they had met. His whole course of conduct had been weak and absolutely self-indulgent and wicked. Who was he to dare to have raised his eyes to this angel, and try to scorch even the hem of her clothing? And now he had only brought suffering upon her, and dimmed the light in God's two stars, which were her eyes. And then wild passion shook him, and he could only live again the divine moments when she had nestled unresisting in his arms. Would it have made things better or worse if he had not yielded to the temptation of that hour of night and solitude? After all, the sin was in making her love him, not in just holding her and kissing her lips. And at least, they would have that exquisite memory of moments of unutterable bliss to keep for the rest of their lives. His windows were wide open, and he leaned upon the balcony and gazed out at the moon. What good had all his life been? What benefit had he brought to anyone? Then he seemed to see a clear vision of Theodora's short existence. Every picture she had unconsciously shown him was of some gentle thought of unselfishness for others. And now he had lain a burden upon her shoulders, when he would not hurt a hair of her head, that dear, exquisite head which had lain upon his breast only 2 hours ago and could never lie there again. He knew this was the end. Then anguish and remorse seized him, and he buried his face on his crossed arms. And Theodora staggered up to her room like one half dead. Mercifully, Josiah Brown had gone to bed, leaving a message with Henriette, Theodora's maid, that on no account was she to make any noise or disturb him. Henriette adored her mistress, as who did not who served her, and she felt distressed to see Madame so pale. Doubtless Madame had had a most tiring day. Madame had, and was thankful when at last she was left alone with her thoughts. Then she, too, opened wide the windows and gazed at the moon. She had no cause for remorse for evil conduct like Hector. She had made no plans for the entrapping of any soul, and yet she felt forlorn and wicked. Oh, yes, she was awake now and knew where she had been drifting, and so love had come at last, and indeed it meant life. This blast had struck her, and she had been blind in not recognizing it at once. But oh, how sweet it was, love, and it seemed as if it could make everything good and fair. If he and she who loved each other could have belonged to each other, surely they might have shed joy and gladness and kindness on all around. Then she lay on her bed, and did not try to reason any more. She only knew she loved Hector Bracondale with all her heart and being, and that she was married to Josiah Brown. And what would the days be when she never saw him? And he, too, he would be sad, and then there was poor Josiah, who was so generous to her. He could not help being vulgar and unsympathetic, and her duty was to make him happy. Well, she could do that. She would try her very best to do that. But thrills ran through her with the recollection of the moments in the drive to Paris. Oh, why had no one told her or warned her all her life about this good thing, love? At last, worn out with all emotions, sleep gently closed her eyes. And fate up above laughed no more. Her sport was over for a time. She had made a sorry ending to their happy day. End of chapter 13.